There are songs for every mood. We can feel every emotion, whenever we want. We just have to press play.
You've experienced one of those moments while driving, you're sitting in the back seat, perhaps it's raining, and this emotional song comes on the radio. And perhaps you're not feeling or going through what the singer is, but this song has you feeling all sorts of emotions. And you just stare out the window and pretend that you're starring in this dramatic and emotional music video.
I'm trying to have an emotional moment here.
I think we've all done this at some point in our lives. A song gets us feeling all sorts of things and we act on it. Music has the power to make us feel something. And one song is all it takes to remind you of a sad or painful time in your life. But music doesn't just remind us of our past moments. It can help us experience, express, or even process some pretty deep feelings. Now, the truth is that in our lives we will experience sadness. And we have since childhood. But the things that made us sad when we were kids are probably not the same things that make us sad now. I mean, I'd still be sad if I dropped my ice cream on the ground, but I don't think I'd cry about it now. Instead, the passing sadness of not getting that candy bar you wanted or breaking your favorite toy has been replaced by pain and sadness caused by other things, and sometimes this sadness can linger. But we're not always good at dealing with sadness, are we? Sometimes we disguise our sadness with anger, sarcasm, or callousness. Or we feel embarrassed by our sadness, as if feeling sad means that we are not strong or resilient. We get overwhelmed by our sadness because we haven't learned how to manage certain big feelings. Or we ignore our sadness because we'd rather focus on feeling happy than dealing with the things that are making us feel sad. Today we're going to talk about something called lament, and we're going to look at a few stories and songs in the Bible. And together we're going to see how these passages of scripture can guide us, give us words to say, and maybe even give us hope in our sadness. So maybe you're thinking, what is lament? Lament is a passionate expression of grief and sorrow. Lament is facing our sadness instead of ignoring it. It is feeling our sadness instead of numbing it. It is working through our sadness instead of just getting over it. Sometimes we make the mistake of believing that we shouldn't feel certain emotions if we follow Jesus, or that feeling sadness, grief, frustration, or anger means that we don't trust God or we don't have enough faith. Or we believe that following Jesus means that we should always be full of hope, joy, and peace. But the Bible tells us a different story. Scripture is filled with stories of people whose lives were really difficult. And so they responded with a full range of emotions, including grief, sadness, frustration, and anger. Now, in the series, we're talking about worship and how the book of Psalms can help us discover how to connect with God. Now, you might think that worship songs should always be full of joy and praise and stories of victory. But the book of Psalms contains worship songs that are full of pain, grief, and even anger. Psalm 55 is one of many examples. It is a song in scripture that expresses pain over being betrayed by a trusted friend. Verse 1 to 8 says, "Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me and I am distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked, for they bring down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had wings of a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm." Now, I don't know about you, but I can feel the anguish and distress in these sentences. These battle cries to God against the author's enemies. The author doesn't see a happy end in sight. They're in deep distress. The psalmist is shouting out to God, I'm not okay with this injustice. I'm not okay with this grief. I'm not okay with what has happened. Our world is more connected than it has ever been, which means that we are able to be more aware of the tragedies happening in our communities, in our country, and in the world. And because we live in such a broken world, We often see injustices like the power taking advantage of the vulnerable, tragedy hitting good people, physical and mental illnesses impacting loved ones, injustice and pain everywhere. And this psalm is a lament for injustice. It is a faithful protest to God over the hard things we face in the world, giving words to the psalmist's protests as well as to ours. It expresses honest feelings even though they might be uncomfortable. And it teaches us that lament makes our worship honest. In another song of lament, the psalmist David expresses more honest questions and pleas while feeling like everyone is out to get him. Psalm 22 verse 1 and 2 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Lament is what happens when we experience something so difficult that we allow ourselves to wonder, God, where are you? Why have you abandoned me? Why aren't you helping me? Do you even hear me? Psalm 22 doesn't ignore or shy away from life's darkest moments or the doubt and despair that we can experience when things get difficult. But now let's look at the very next psalm, also written by David. Psalm 23 verse 1 and 4. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. In the psalm, David acknowledges that life is sometimes dark and terrifying, even as he sings about God's peace and protection. The confidence and peace found in this psalm doesn't negate the grief and desperation from the previous psalm, but it's because of the darkness that David experienced that he learned to trust God. When David felt alone, he learned to say that God is with me. When David was in need, he learned to say that God will supply. And when David felt exhausted, he learned to say that God will give me rest. It's easy to worship God when our lives are great. But can we find a way to worship when things look bleak? When we acknowledge, question, or even protest the difficulties that we experience, it doesn't mean that our faith is shallow. Instead, it can actually help deepen our faith. These Psalms teach us that our worship of God shouldn't just happen in the best and brightest moments of our life. But like the psalmist, we can worship even in the deepest valleys of fear and desperation, because lament makes our worship deeper. Now, after Jesus was betrayed and let down by the people he loved, after he was arrested, beaten, and left to suffer and die, it is no surprise that he repeated the words in Psalm 22 while he was on the cross. Mark chapter 15 verse 34 says, And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now here's what's so interesting about this moment. Jesus knew how his story was going to end. He knew that it wasn't going to end in the grave, that death was not the end of the story, but that he would live again, and death would be defeated forever. But in the meantime, Jesus still felt real grief and pain and despair, and he still suffered and was filled with sorrow. By crying out these words, Jesus showed us how to be honest with the sadness that we feel sometimes. Just as Jesus knew that God was with him even as he was dying, we can be assured that there is hope for us even if we can't see it yet. Further, in Psalm 55, David wrote in verses 22 and 23, Cast your cares on the Lord and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken. But you, God, will bring down the wicked into the pit of decay. The bloodthirsty and deceitful will not live out half their days. But as for me, I trust in you. Sometimes trust is difficult. Sometimes it's difficult to worship. But like David, we can trust that God knows our futures, even when they feel dark, because lament makes us look for hope even if we can't see it yet. From David to Jesus to so many others, we see so many examples in scriptures of people who didn't shy away from pain, but worshiped God in the midst of it. And that's the point. Sometimes life is painful, but we can worship even when it's difficult. So the next time you feel sadness, anger, or grief, I hope that you don't ignore it or stuff it down. I hope that you don't feel embarrassed or overwhelmed by it, but I hope that you bring it to God in lament as an act of worship. In some of life's most painful moments, let's turn that pain into deep and honest worship.